Thank you, Jim. Well, today we're talking about DE&I, which over the past 2 years has been featured in many conversations at many conferences, covering extensively the benefits of paying close attention to inclusion in the workplace. The difference is that today we speak with the Gartner champion, Deborah Christmas. Hello, Deborah. Welcome.
Hello, Fawn. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure, believe me. So, Deborah, I'm going to go straight into the questions. It's the last session of the day. As you examine the current DE&I situation with Fortune 1000 companies and governments, have you found there's been a change over time?
Yes, we have, Fawn, because the events of the last 2 years have certainly raised the visibility to these really important issues. It's on everybody's radar. There isn't a CEO on the face of the planet who doesn't have to address this in some way. The real question is, what's the way? Because we know there are, check the box type things, and then there are real initiatives. So that's really what's at the heart of what's going on now is, what are people actually doing?
So, where do leaders and influencers, in your opinion, start the conversation besides HR, which, of course, everyone's trying to be politically correct? But what's the checklist and what's best practices from what you've seen? You've been in so many companies, so you would have a really great idea of the best coming forward.
Well, you actually said the word in your question. It starts with simply having conversations, one person at a time. Get curious about people around you, raise your head up and pay attention to the things that, you might not have ever paid attention to them before. This is not a new topic. Organizations have been talking about this for years, decades. We've got programs, we've got policies, we've got initiatives, and they do have their place, like any other policy of the organization. But that's not what really drives true change. It's our behaviors, one person at a time. I'm gonna use a quote that I heard about sustainability that I think is really aligns to diversity. The quote was by Anne-Marie Bonneau. I don't know this person. The zero waste chef is what she is famous for. And here's what she said. We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. That applies to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Every single one of us has a part to play. So what we all need to figure out is what's our part and then do our part.
Well, I guess the big thing is that we do understand that values of all those individuals you just mentioned manifest itself throughout the corporation in its behavior. So, how do you go about influencing that? Because that's a lot more difficult than just putting out a corporate mandate when you have to influence each individual at a time.
Yeah, it's really hard, but because values is what we live by, right? And they're the compass that guide us, both personally and professionally. We all want to live by strong values. We want to walk the talk every single day. Some days it's harder than others. We teach our children values, but we all know what good looks like. Trust, integrity, honesty, transparency. No one would say that those values are not important. So now you got to think about how do they manifest in the corporate environment, because they are engraved on plaques in the lobby. They're on granite as you approach the building. We treat our employees with respect. We have integrity. We hold ourselves accountable. We take pride in serving our customers. We all understand these company values. They're the guiding principles, the fundamental beliefs that the organization operates under. So the hard part is, how do they manifest in behaviors in the organization? And how do we hold ourselves accountable for those behaviors?
Well, what's interesting is, you brought up the word accountability a couple of times just in what you said. But how do we hold leadership more accountable? We're always talking about employees, but how do we hold leadership more accountable?
Well, there's the $64,000 question. First of all, it takes courage on so many levels, because again, no one wants to be on the wrong side of this, but executives they're almost paralyzed to know what to do. So here's some things that I think about. They can start really truly assessing, what does the organization stand for? Like really, I'm not being funny. Are they clear with the values and the behavior expectations? And how are they behaving as leaders? How are they behaving What is their brand? Are they walking the talk? In some cases, there might require a changing of the guard in some respects because not all executives are actually on board, like recognizing their own biases, recognizing behaviors that, don't align. And it isn't about the big things, meaning we know when somebody says something really inappropriate, like the N word. Okay. No one's going to argue how wrong that is. And no one's going to argue that there should be consequences for that. But some of the other microaggressions that might not be so recognizable, they're hard. They're harder. And the thing about leadership that people need to understand, if you're sitting in a position of leadership, not handling things is a really poor reflection on you as a leader. Human beings are going to make mistakes. They're going to do the wrong thing. They're going to say the wrong thing. But you as a leader has to stand forward and say, that's not acceptable. What's the plan? What are we going to do about it? Because if you don't, and if you ignore it, you're kind of in the same bucket as a person who made the big mistake because you don't have the courage to go and deal with it.
Well, what use cases do you know that can show a lens of proof that bad behavior has its consequences?
Well, I don't have examples from a client perspective. I know there are a number of case studies out there that are reported in Harvard Business Review and other kinds of, publications of that nature. But we do see organizations taking swift action. And that's actually the best use case, whoever you are. They have shown that inappropriate behavior, commentary, whatever it is not going to be tolerated in any way. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to be fired. Okay? We've got this cancel culture thing. You might have to be, depending on what the issue is. It just means there's consequences for what we do. So often, one very swift public action, boy, that can send a strong message so quickly. It's a test of leadership, and everybody understands right away. It catches everybody where they're like, ooh, okay, that was an action. And that's all it can take. Now, there's also education. So there's things where it might be a very public response. In other cases, it might be, we've got to get our organization together very quickly and deal with this. I'll use the Starbucks example. Let's use an example. We all remember 2 years ago, I think it was, when there was two people of color that were treated very badly within a Starbucks. They closed their sites down for like a week to do education and training. Now think about that for a second. The financial cost of doing that was huge, but it sent a very big message that everybody needs to be educated and that this is not going to be tolerated, but we're going to educate first, and we're going to also take action. That's a perfect example of addressing something and not letting it go by the wayside.
Great example. So then on the more positive side, how many Fortune 1000 companies are living up to this new decree that you know of, besides Starbucks?
Well, I don't have a number. I wish I did. This was a topic of discussion in our diversity call just literally 24 hours ago, that there are some really good companies doing really good work. They're being very public. They're sharing. They're very publicly stating on their websites, in their LinkedIn presence, in their Facebook presence, what they stand for, what they're doing. They're promising very, very clearly that this is who we are as an organization for the world to see, That's a good one. Some of the other things that I've seen, I'm going to use Gartner as an example because I was very impressed with what we did when Mr. Floyd was killed. So Gartner, after the death of Mr. Floyd, like most corporate entities, really started conversations within the organization. And we started these events called Real Talks. We started the first one, which was on what the events that had happened and how Black employees were feeling and what that meant to us. And that opened up a world of discussion on issues in general. We had another one for veterans. We had another one for our LGBT community. We had another one for cognitive diversity, whether you're on the autism spectrum or there were mental health challenges. I am telling you, the bravery that I saw of people share their stories I was crying, and many people were crying. I thought that was a very brave move of the organization to open that up and to create what we call, safety, psychological safety within an organization for people to just bare their soul and share their experience. And I think it really connected us to each other as associates of Gartner, but it also elevated our awareness of the multitude of challenges that exist around, many of these issues, increased our sensitivity to challenges. When people said, how hard it was for them to get up in the morning and to, focus and do this and do work, I'm like, wow, that's not even an issue. My issue might be a person of color, but that's not an issue for me. So what does that do? It educates us. It educates that there are things going on in people's world. And when we talk about, bringing your whole self to work, that's yourself. That's yourself. So if an organization can create an environment where that's okay, I think that's a really wonderful thing.
So then how does Gartner or any organization who's doing something really great, that's a great initiative, continue to evolve and stay abreast of, these very important matters?
It's going to sound a little trite, but ask your people. Ask your people. We have organizations that have representation across many fronts. Maybe the C-suite is not as diverse, but the organization certainly is. And there are people from different backgrounds, different cultures. There is a wealth of insight and information within the four walls of your organization. Start asking questions. Start asking people, what would you do? What do you need to see? Maybe even say, can you tell us about your experience? Can you share what it has been like to be a person of color in a predominantly, white environment? I'll just use as an example. People have asked me that question. They've had no insight into what my journey might have been, but you've asked me to share some of my story, and I'll share it. The key is to create an environment where they will tell you. And that's a great start.
It is. It's certainly simple and clear. But I think what's not clear, and maybe you can succinctly articulate it, how does one learn or how does one know that although they might be ignorant, it doesn't justify being in the right, or that it is so wrong there's going to be a consequence. And I think that's a big gap too. How do you resolve that? Because education can only go so far. You're talking more generic when you're doing the education. You're not doing specifics.
So we all have biases. All of us do. I learned a new term a couple of weeks ago through Jennifer Riel, who was our guest speaker for International Women's Day. And she talked about mental models. And I thought that is such a better word or set of words, because biases has a negative connotation to it, where I have to fix something, it's something's wrong with me, versus mental models. And the way she described it is we all have them. We're raised a certain way. We come up in a certain environment. And I initially thought, oh, that's the lens that we look through the world at. And she said to me, it's not the lens, it's the filter. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is so true. The world is very, very complex. We have a lot of things coming at us. We can only take in so much at a time. So we filter and we take things in that reinforce some of the things that we believe. And this is where we have to make the shift, is that time has changed. And to your point, Fawn, things that might have been acceptable 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, are no longer acceptable. We're smarter. We're smarter now. We understand that certain terms are inappropriate. And I'll quote Maya Angelou, who said, when you know better, you do better. And that's really what the ticket is. If we could all just acknowledge there is stuff for us to learn, we don't know it all. Some of the things that we think were correct or are correct are not. So let's get ourselves educated, because it doesn't have to be formal corporate education. And then here's the other quote, let's be the change we want to see in the world.
Wow, what a beautiful way to end this conversation. So thank you, Deborah. It's been very inspiring, and I hope that we can talk about this more in other
Thank you, Fawn.
forums.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that we had the chat.